The following is a fan-made reading of the Pale web serial novel by J.C. McCrae. It describes extra material published after Chapter 6.9 and contains spoilers for that chapter. The original text can be found at palewebserial.wordpress.com. If you'd like to donate to the author, please go to patreon.com/wildbow. Thank you for listening. 6.9 Binding and Countermeasures. Binding and Countermeasures. Brainstorming and ideas from texts at the school. How do we bind or deal with the candid others if we end up having to deal with them? Weapons, tools, resources, and options. If we end up binding, it's hopefully going to be with us getting the okay from the candid others as a group. If we're not in a position to go to them, then we might talk to the judges to get the all clear. Lucy says it's like getting a warrant before making an arrest. The binding is the arrest. Binding is hard. It's effective when it works, but a magic circle is really time-consuming to draw. So our idea is that we have a few circles of varying complexity, or a basic way of drawing up a circle against target or targets, and then the complex one. The benefit of working out a basic circle is that the same ideas that go into making it a circle that contains can also be put into a short barrier or wall. If a circle of fire can keep a ghoul inside it, then a line of fire will keep it from approaching, or keep it from using any of its ghoul mojo or powers. There's also the problem of having to get them into the circle. Some circles will draw them in, others will need us to do the work. We know from the human binding exercises that weakening them in other ways will make the rest easier. Gotta diminish the self, and the same stuff that slows them down or buys us time to get the diagram set up or get to the diagram we've set up in advance is the stuff that works here. Countermeasures. Includes targeting weaknesses, distracting, or hurting them. This sucks. Vessels/hosts. Includes Matthew, host of the Doom of Edith, and Edith, vessel for the Girl by Candlelight. The distinction between vessels and hosts feels a bit funky. Mostly, it seems like if you go overboard, you start to become a vessel, the human part of you becoming a container for the other force. So why does Matthew call himself a host? Pride? Is it the more human side of him sitting in the pilot seat? Vessels and hosts are notoriously difficult to bind. We saw this a bit with Erasmus in the human binding class. If you try to bind the other, they can lean into their human side a bit more, and if you try to bind the person, then they can lean into their other side. Humans are hard to bind too. This means that the binding ritual has to be a complex diagram, lots of moving parts interlinked with emphasis on the links that connect. This isn't really a binding that asks you to double reinforce everything, but instead the intricacy and overall structure will be really important, starting with duality. Hosts with multiple others in them are different, but both Matthew and Edith have just the one. For the duality, we want to have a balanced diagram with stuff mirrored, but reversed. Full hollow matched to hollow full. We want to have stuff in it like yin-yang, but the shape of it can't be a yin-yang since that's already got its own meaning and symbolism. Target both at the same time, and then make the connecting stuff important. That's our starting point. Key stuff to include in the binding diagrams for Matthew, taken from classes with Durocher and the texts. The number 2. We think this is really relevant because of the duality hosting, because he exists as a pair, and it's going to be part of the diagram anyway. Going to other mystical numbers, 5 is the Hierophant, the institution, and is often related to incarnations and other Saturn-related stuff, like fate, destiny, dream. The Doom of Edith is dangerous because it's inevitable. They knock it back, but can't totally stop it. Edith was supposed to die, and death and doom come for her. If we're going to have 3 on one side of the diagram and 2 on the other, it should bias towards the doom. The number 13 is both good as an indicator of misfortune and is the tarot number for death, which covers the transformation and rebirth, not necessarily dying. The number 15 is the devil for shadow self, attachment, and being bound, and is a multiple of 3 and 5. Should be biased towards Matthew instead of the doom. Doom, as a concept, is rooted in fate, mostly, but also death and violence. There aren't a lot of good symbols out there to represent the doom, but Verona thinks a snake would be a good middle ground for the thread of the fate, the skull of the death, and the sword of war. It's flexible, has a head, and has a weapon. We looked it up, and snakes have a long tradition of representing healing and renewal, but Verona says we can have the snake's head point down towards the center, and it could mean something else. We're just going to go with her gut instinct on this. For Matthew's symbol, we pretty much agree the heart works for his human side. Humans have hearts, he loves Edith, and does a lot of exercise, nature stuff. Feels right. Our first take was framing two opposing elements, a ring of 15 hearts / snake loops / heads, and a 13-word binding. Us three of Kennet bind Matthew Moth and the doom of Edith James, with a 5-sided spiral for the center. Verona wants to redo this, with more emphasis on the structural elements so it's not concentric circles. Maybe with rings of weird pentagons for every layer. Have to figure out the repeating pattern for snake loops and hearts, though, and make nicer hearts. This doesn't feel quite right, though. Maybe tree instead of heart? He likes nature and works at the Buckhead. Stuff to include in the binding diagrams for Edith, Vessel. The number 2. Same reasons as Matthew. The number 1. This is a weird one for diagrams, but the girl by candlelight is a spirit, and on her own is very vulnerable to stuff like lines on diagrams and basic circles. Edith's body insulates the girl by candlelight against this stuff and most everyday stuff. The 0 in binding numerology is the hollow circle, like we use for the darkness rune. The 1 then holds something, typically a strong symbol, which flows well into the lines and increases their effect. On the same note, the number 0. The hollow spaces of a diagram are a key part of any hallow, and what we're really trying to do here is make a hallowed space within. This makes the light-dark spaces from 2 pages ago that much more important. Fire-water dichotomy. Not much to say here. Ideas behind experimental proposed binding diagrams for Edith emphasize on triangles because of the base element runes, use of filled and empty spaces, and the patchwork spirit made up of many segments. If it works, it should pull her from 2 directions. Is a negative binding because it is rigid, to oppose the ephemeral spirit. Only issue is how much of a pain it would be to actually draw. We might need a stencil or something. Otherwise, if we used a simpler circle with a ring of water runes, we'd have a fire rune in a hollow in the center. That could work, but we'd have to do something about Edith, who is a bit weaker. Countermeasures. Dwelling on this stuff is a real mood killer, but because humans are way harder to bind than others, it may be that we have to attack or hamper them somehow. While they're close together, they're stronger. They know how to work together. Edith can do her thing, and Matthew can help and protect her. Kind of. When they're apart, Matthew can use his doom. So it gets really, really tricky to bind them, because Edith is going to stop us from binding Matthew, and Matthew will stop us from binding Edith. It's almost like they're not a duality host, but a quadra-mega host. Sort of have to tie everything about them all up in a neat bow. We'll have to think on this more. Night Hags / Nightmares includes Alpina. Excerpt. As a general rule, the night hag may only be vulnerable for binding when on the hunt for her nightly meal or when baited out into negotiation. The night hag pursues single targets with a given hag's disposition for periodic large meals or many smaller ones varying from hag to hag. Those who would wish to bind the hag should study her pattern and be prepared to interfere. As the hag prepares to target a particular subject, she must extend her vile being to them, and in this reaching, she forgoes her ability to travel or be vague in nature. Vulnerabilities will be magnified, and it costs her dearly to abandon her prey once so extended. One may present themselves, a volunteer, or a deserving hapless unawakened, as bait, then use the means and methods detailed in this chapter to corner the depraved night witch and bind her wholly. The book on night hags, and nightmares in general, seem to assume that they're really hard to corner if they don't want a confrontation, and a lot of prep is needed to have any chance of success at all. It also assumes they're evil, and we're pretty sure that Alpina isn't that evil. More attention is given to the ways of handling a night hag. These ways fall into 2 categories. First, a lot of them discourage the night hag, trying to make her go to a new target or make her stop long enough that she can be talked to, at which point the practitioner offers deals like,
"Go manipulate this person's dream, and I'll give you this."
These discouragements are really weird and lame, apparently because the night hag is pretty immaterial and stuck obeying some odd rules and superstitions. Seems to require at least 2 of the 3 following things for optimal effect. Sealing off the physical space the hag is in, This can be the night hag entering a room through a tight space, like a crack under a door or a knothole, then blocking off that space. Cuts off her access to the flows and realms, and forces she taps for power and sustenance. They immediately get feeble and weak, like they're starving. Displays of dominance are getting the upper hand. Stuff in this category includes things like stealing her stuff, laughing in her face, or humiliating her. Confidence, presentation, and flair are pretty key here. There's some weird-ass patriarchy BS in this too, so we're not sure how much to listen to it. All about making her meek so you can negotiate from a position of power. Measures focused around day-night, sleep, protection, and general warding. Stuff like lines of salt in the windowsill, lending your pillow to an animal in the daytime so she can't find you even if she's right there and you're lying in bed, tricking her into thinking it's daytime, and drinking milk. The other approach is more focused. The Somnambulance text has a list of materials that hurt night creatures, including pure things like clear running water, salt, bright light, silver, and cleansing smoke. Some of these are tied to cardinal elements like earth, air, fire, and water, and can be matched to a specific night creature. Then there's hag stuff, capitalizing on how they used to be human but aren't anymore. Icons of civilization like loud music, running machinery, television, and complex locks can ward them off or diminish them. These things can stop her in her tracks, so practice can be put into place. In some cases, these approaches can be combined, leading to stories and situations like throwing a puzzle at a hag and demanding she solve it. Bewildered, she may end up trying to solve it in a fluster, while you can draw the binding around her. Salt, chalk, and milk can make a good negative binding, while black soot, black oil, putrefying fats, heated so it'll run, murky water the light can't shine through, and tangled string all work for the night hag, either because she's a night creature or a hag. Circles are supposed to be hollow, attuned against immaterial threats, and above all, are interpersonal. Because the night hag has an intimate relationship with her target, the most effective bindings will have a place for the practitioner in them. If the practitioner turns away, the binding gets way weaker. If the practitioner remains, even a chalk circle will hold a lot of weight. It's a bit like locking her in a room with you, knowing she'll starve to death before you do, and will wilt in any sunlight, etc., over hours. Symbols for dark and light are common, and motifs of the sun and moon are good for negative and positive bindings, in that order. Because night hags easily traverse realms and dreams, the sun, moon, and stars are used to help keep them present. We also want to use a wheel or clock motif at the inside rim to block passage. We could fill it in for structure, but that takes time. Taken from the book, there are variants that put the practitioner and the other further apart, but they're less strong. We know Alpi, so this is easier. It's worth saying, but if we end up going this route, then one of us is going to be tied up sitting in the circle to pin her down until we can get her to surrender. Ugh. The Fairy includes Guilherme, Fae of the High Summer, and Marichica, young Fae of the Dark Fall. No lie, if it comes to us needing to bind them, then we might be in a pretty bad spot. The Fairy are tricky. It's like Guilherme is crazy good at fighting, especially if it's a duel or something organized where he can manipulate the organized part, but he's a better schemer according to Marichica than he is a fighter. The only benefit/hope really is that Guilherme is going the way of winter and isn't that interested in scheming, which could be the ploy, but we can hope. Meanwhile, Marichica is young. She's essentially at the far end of the scale. Guilherme isn't secretly saying his praises or making us extra wary of her, at least on that front, so she might not be that crazy good at manipulation. Maybe. But that could be like saying she's 50 times better than us instead of 300 times better than us. Trying to do something like trap them in a binding is like going into things with John by planning a shootout. This is where we really need a good plan of mostly countermeasures. Just in case, positive and negative bindings and barriers. High Summer have an affinity for yew, wine, and honey. They're weak to poisons, tarnished or rusty metal, and heartbreak. Dark Fall likes bones, charms, curses, fine chain, especially silver or cold forged, virgin flesh, and secret names a weakness. Because we can't expect to bind them, we plan to disrupt. Big explosions, blitzes, disruption, and unexpected stuff. We can't get caught up in their games, social or otherwise. After discussing it, we're thinking we should hit the market with the teacher's help if that's still on. Either Dark Fall to get info on Marichica, or the Fall Court above, to see if a fairy would be willing to give us something to use. Fey tricks and wiles against Fey. Maybe. We don't have a great Fey-focused lecturer unless the Vanderwerf family comes to teach, and, well, they're Vanderwerfs. Seems like we'd be beneath their notice. Lucy thinks that Ray might be a good person to ask. Big, mega huge priority is to figure out the traps and have a plan in place. Marichika said there'd be some. It's been a month, and apparently we haven't seen one yet. 3 of our gifts, possibly 1 gift for each of us, has some hidden catch. That's bad, and it's so easy to forget it's a thing. If we need to bind them, we're going to have to hope we can get help. John or the goblins, in coordination with tools and stuff. According to A Circle of Cold Iron, one good thing about beating a fairy is that if you can get a victory, it tends to be decisive. They fold. Silver relates to the Winter Court, tarnishes easily, and has a long tradition of something that penetrates illusions. Light reflected off of silver can, with intent or power behind it, hurt illusions. At the same time, Fae can treat it as a positive binding thing in some cases, and will trade for it or use it. It's very context dependent, and stuff like the silver being polished or being a knife versus being jewelry will matter a lot. We should get some. Dog tag / dog of war. Includes John Styles. This one doesn't need to be too long. Dog tags are animuses, and they're really easy to bind, at least on one level. The diagram doesn't matter that much, and a chalk circle could work. Where it gets tricky is the flow of power from the war to John makes the circle hard to close. This is supposedly going to make stuff like putting the chalk on the floor a lot harder, and will make John stop like he's hit a wall before he can get sucked into it. He's basically too big, metaphysically, to fit unless the diagram is massive and has a lot of power. This can come and go with the state of the war overseas, but it's not impossible. The practitioners that got the rest of John's squad managed it. Then there's other stuff. Dog tags who sit in a binding circle for long enough apparently get a get-out-of-jail-free card, if and only if there's conflict around them. More conflict means faster turnaround on this, but if there's a war, battle, or armed feud in the region, it's never more than 24 hours. If there isn't, this doesn't apply. In hectic cases, this can happen fast, and in really hectic cases, dog tags can have frag tags to blow up the chalk lines or chains or whatever, and black dogs to mess up the metaphysical stuff. Most war mage practitioners will take the bound dog tag far away to get clear of this. And finally, just so we're reminding ourselves of the stuff to watch out for, let's not forget John is smart and rigged bombs to catch up if we try to bind him. He takes steps. We do have a countermeasure available, and it's pretty awful. If we need to stall John or keep him in one place, technically he's sworn to come to us if we toss our tags down. We wouldn't need to get them back, but we could get him where we need him. Hate this. Hate it. Goblins Assorted. Includes Toadswallow, Blunt Munch, Gashwad, Cherry Pop, Doglit, Buddy McButtbutt, Snatch Ragged, Unnamed Nosepick, plus several others. Putting the goblin names at the top of the page is a big wake-up call. It's a lot. Goblins are pretty notorious for getting everywhere and being everywhere, and it's really starting to hit home that this is a thing that happens. The biggest factor with goblins is that they're so versatile. Toadswall, especially, has some out-there tricks and goblin-y magic items, with a bunch of tricks up his sleeve, but all of them have these little things they can do. Gashwad can tear up the practice and turn it against the practitioner. Blunt Munch can take charge of lesser goblins and easily grab more. Doglick has screams and howls and feral instinct. Snatch Ragged is good at breaking stuff. And Buddy is this slippery little nugget of awful that builds up in intensity until he decides to utterly obliterate something in a disgusting way. And most are really brutal in a fight. So it's not just that we'd be dealing with the chaos and unpredictability of 10 plus small, aggressive, noxious little dudes and dudettes, but every few seconds one of them is going to be doing stuff that we have to react to or handle. The situation may be the opposite of the plan for Fairy. We need to avoid a fight or confrontation, or control it if we can. Goblins listen to strength, so a countermeasure might be to win over the lesser goblins so the more canny ones who can do something can't use them. Toadswall springs to mind, but Blunt isn't dumb, and Gashwad is, on paper, as a blighter, as little as labels matter, who's good at messing with practice. They shouldn't be able to injure us, so that does help. The stuff that binds Goblin is pretty varied, but Cherry Pop told us the big one, and the books back it up. Metal with earth, air, water, fire, electricity, smoke, or whatever else is moving through it will be the best thing. The existence of this stuff is why goblins don't go that far into the heart of Kennet and prefer to stay at the fringes by water, at the north end of downtown, in the woods, etc. We could use that to retreat to places, maybe? But the mundane means of binding could work too. Chains, rope, they can keep a goblin put. Goblins that are tied up and bound with ropes or chains tend to stop fighting pretty fast since they have low patience. Clean still water, salt, holly, and other natural things will hold up a goblin. A lot of the time they can't actually do anything about these. Put a goblin in a bathtub with clean water and they can't even spit in it, can't stain it, can't really move, so they'll freeze. Same thing goes for holly, salt, and other pure elements. The problem is getting there. Bound goblins can become weapons or tools, and we should expect some goblins to use this. 2 unarmed goblins can easily become 1 goblin with a nasty weapon. They can also bind one another, which beats us to the punch, which is a complicated mess. Writing this out, it feels like we should be very mindful of the boss goblins, Toad, Swallow, and Blunt. They wouldn't bow down or put themselves at the mercy of another goblin, so if they fall, the rabble will be a lot less organized. Spooky to think about a confrontation. Lost. Includes Miss and Snowdrop. This is a tricky one. Lost don't follow any particular rules and are next to Oni, apparently, as others who break the rules, like how Snowdrop's speech is flipped around in attention. So all we've got to go on is, well, what Miss told us she's most afraid of. Establishing patterns that catch her/them up in or assigning labels to her. From the way Miss describes things, any ritual with enough activity and power can snag her and will pull her in, making it hard for her to climb out. Outside of that, we just don't know. Typing this up feels awful, but it's necessary. Like John, she said she'd come when called, and we'd be abusing that in the worst way to make her worst fear come true if we called her into a binding circle. Other than that, she's quick, and she has a really deep and subtle understanding of practice and how these things work. This also includes stuff like practitioner-other relationships and mentalities. Instead of dwelling on this and getting Verona to do a complex ritual that could snag Miss, we've decided what we'll do is talk to the family of finders I've been in touch with and ask about measures for the lost, just in case. Putting Snowdrop in the same group. Not so great at fighting, not especially dangerous, but they know us/me. They've got the lowdown info on us, and that's really dangerous in its own way. I really don't think Snow is a culprit, or even Miss, but we can't afford to let our guards down. 9 others. We still have research to complete on this, but we've got notes on a few for the next few pages. Putting a note here as a reminder to ourselves. The new others who are brought in to help with the perimeter are potential allies of the culprit, so we should make some mental notes on how to deal with them. Fortunately, they don't sound too strong, and we have labels for 2. Tashlit is a god begotten. Apparently the birds and bees of the gods are sort of prone to making monsters. The theory is that a lot of the time they'll cover it up by making excuses and calling it a curse. Since the various gods, known and super out of the way, aren't really talking to people all the time, they're hard to call out on stuff like this, with their excuses over monstrous bastard kids. Ugh. Big thing for god-begotten others is that the limits on what they can pull are really, really up there. It may require conditions like breaches of karma, trespasses on property, or for the god-begotten to get really upset, but if they do cut loose, it's like a granny lifting a car. Except it's a bird-headed guy leveling buildings with a screamer, literally moving a mountain 50 feet. That's only if innocents are paying attention. The seal weakened them all, and it's only the first generation of god-begottens that are over the top. The second generation ones only have a small fraction of this, and a really high chance of being sterile. So sad. Sig is an ambulatory object. We may actually have another, weaker than Cherry Pop. It's a cigarette. It's not personified, it doesn't speak, it just shows up places, has an inhuman ambient awareness, and never goes out or really diminishes. Apparently, Sig is keeping an eye on the perimeter and will show up burning a hole on a map, Ouija board, or a list of names when convenient. Add to Matthew and Edith. Quick note while we're thinking about it. Binding Matthew. We were chatting about them being a quartet more than 2 hosts, and the stuff that has to be handled, and I sorta have one idea. And it's awful. This entire thing, thinking about how to deal with the others who've given us gifts, it's awful. But we don't have to bind both Matthew and the Doom. If we bind the Doom and just the Doom, then Matthew can't go anywhere. If he separates from it, then he's risking that it will hurt Edith, and we know he doesn't want that. These are the options we have. Ways of arresting the culprits. It's easy to see why they hate and loathe practitioners, because this is the sort of thing that other practitioners do. Note to self, no time to edit the doc and keep it tidy, so just add this to the Matthew and Edith part of the document later. Gotta prep for Lucy's implement ritual tomorrow. This has been a fan-made reading of extra material from the web serial Pale by J.C. McRae. The original text can be found at palewebserial.wordpress.com. If you'd like to donate to the author, please go to patreon.com/wildbow.